All right, hello everybody. Let's talk about DNA structure today. Some of you may have learned a little bit about DNA when you were in junior high. Let's see what we can find out. Okay, first of all, what is DNA? Well, nobody really calls it this, but it stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, and so you need to write that down. At any time during this presentation, if I'm going too fast, just pause me, write down what you need to, and then we'll get going again. So deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA. And yes, you should write that down. DNA is found in let me get my picture out of the way, nucleus of a cell. Hopefully you learned that in 7th grade. DNA carries all of the genes for an organism. So a gene, you guys, is something that tells your body I got to think about the right way to say it. Kind of what your traits are. So, like, I have a gene that gave me green eyes, and I have a gene that gave me dark hair, and I have a gene that made me this tall, and whatever. Many genes that made me how tall I am. DNA helps determine what a person will be like physically and even emotionally. Did you know you had genes for your emotions? Who knew? So there's an impact on your emotions from genetics. How you respond to different situations is partly controlled by your genetics. Okay, so what's a chromosome? I mentioned the word genes. Oops, I just cannot put my picture in the right place for the life of me. Okay, a chromosome is a twisted strand of DNA that's found in the nucleus of every cell. And we often show chromosomes as looking kind of like a letter X. However, you don't want to get confused because there is a specific chromosome that we talk about called the X chromosome, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But most of the chromosomes sort of have an appearance of a letter X. Humans have 46 chromosomes. 2 of the chromosomes are called our sex chromosomes, so they determine our biological sex. So females are XX for that last pair of chromosomes, and males are XY. We're going to talk a little bit about gender nonconforming and some other things that can happen biologically, but there are a million different varieties of things that determine our gender and our sex, and so I can only touch base on a few of them. So it says here, biological sex does not necessarily equal gender identity, and we will talk about that. The other 44 chromosomes that you have, so we have 46 total, 2 of the chromosomes determine your sex. The other 44 chromosomes are called autosomes, and they're important in the sense that they're the same no matter what your sexual identity is. We all have the same other 44 chromosomes. The other thing on this page that I think is interesting for students is to take a look at the table on the left and how many chromosomes different organisms have. Take a look at dog. Notice that dogs have 78 chromosomes. KJ, does that mean they're smarter than humans? No, it just means they have more chromosomes than we do, and their chromosomes might be smaller. Maybe we have taller chromosomes, maybe they have shorter chromosomes. All kinds of reasons would explain why dogs have 78. What is important to understand is that everybody has their proper number of chromosomes, and especially this is true in humans. And there's some organisms that this is not as important in, but anytime a human is born with the wrong number of chromosomes, either extra chromosomes or missing chromosomes, there's always a syndrome associated with that, and usually it's fatal. That means that lots of times babies that have an extra or missing chromosome die as miscarriages. And when they do survive, they often have some kind of a disability. We'll talk about a little bit of that a little bit later. Okay, so let's just touch base. This is not in your notes right now. Let's just touch base really quickly about gender. Gender biology is like your sex chromosomes, genitals, sex hormones, reproductive structures. Gender identity is how a person sees themselves as male or female, both, neither, and there's lots of variations within. And then gender expression is sort of how we show ourselves to our society. What clothing do we wear? That kind of thing, and what are our behaviors? That's gender expression. There are so many ways that biology and gender overlap, and there's some ways that they don't overlap. So let me just give you some examples, and literally there are so many examples that I can't name them all. So I'm going to give you a few things. One syndrome that we have that's very common is called Klinefelter syndrome. And Klinefelter syndrome is babies that are born with an extra X chromosome. So that means that these babies have 47 chromosomes instead of 46. And this is one of those examples where it is a survivable condition. And not only is it survivable, these kids are mentally perfectly normal. It's just some things go wrong physically. Wrong is a funny way of saying it, but So they have an extra X chromosome. So the Y chromosome is what gives boys their genitals. So it's where the penis comes from. So these are definitely boys. How, whoops. I did that. However, they have an extra X chromosome. And so what happens when they hit puberty is they have too much of the female hormone estrogen and they start to develop breasts. So it's not that they have female reproductive structures, they could never get pregnant. And this has nothing to do with gender identity. It's completely separate. So it doesn't mean that they're gay, it doesn't mean that they're transgender. It's just that these are boys who, when they hit puberty, start to develop breasts. Their voices don't get lower. They often don't get hair on their faces because they have too much of the female hormone estrogen, but no impact on gender identity. Here's another example. This one's called bladder exstrophy. In this case, this is where it's a birth defect where the bladder forms outside of the body. It has no impact on the sex chromosomes or the hormones, no impact on gender identity. However, it might cause the genitals not to form correctly. So you might have a boy that doesn't have a penis because the bladder formed where the penis was supposed to. So we have really awesome surgeries nowadays where we can rebuild structures that get damaged by those kinds of birth defects. What's interesting about this one, it says, in the past, with conditions that damaged male genitals, parents were told to raise their biological sons as daughters. This does have an impact on gender identity, with many XY males feeling trapped in the wrong body. So this was a huge problem for people that it happened to. It was very rare. But when it did happen, and these boys were raised as girls, it was very mentally difficult for these boys. All right, that was just one example. So there's many, 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 many more examples that we could talk about. All right, how are chromosomes, genes, and DNA? It's supposed to say related, I think. There we go. So this is back on your note sheet again, so you need to write these things down. It says chromosomes, remember they looked kind of like an X. They're made of DNA. And sections of chromosomes are called genes. You have 20 to 25,000 genes on your 46 chromosomes. And the genes determine things like your eye color, your hair color, your skin color, whether or not you're going to get cancer, whether or not you have a birth defect, all those kinds of things. All right, and then we always have to go back to history just a little bit. In 1953, Watson and Crick, these two handsome fellows there, using Rosalind Franklin's X-ray crystallography technique, determined the complementary double helix shape of the DNA molecule. So they received the Nobel Prize along with, Maurice Wilkins. I forgot his name for a second. She did not get the Nobel Prize with them because she had passed away. Her work with radiation caused her to develop cancer at a young age. Maybe she would have had that cancer anyway, but she died at a very young age, and so she was not, unfortunately, was not given the Nobel Prize. And the thing that I wanted to focus on was the shape, the double helix. We often call the double helix, and I think you have to write this down. Oh yeah, it's in quotation marks, a twisted ladder. So imagine a ladder that has steps going across, and now the ladder goes like this and it twists, and there's still those steps going across. That's what a double helix is. So you write double helix and then twisted ladder. All right, DNA is made of repeating units that are called nucleotides. You need to write the nucleotides down. Nucleotides consist of one nitrogen base, and the nitrogen bases are labeled with 4 different letters: A, T, C, or G. Now, these are all molecules. It's not like they really have the letter A, T, C, or G. The letters stand for the names of these molecules. Okay, so a nucleotide also has one phosphate molecule, and it has one deoxyribose sugar, which is 5-sided. So let me just show you a nucleotide on this really quickly. So this is the DNA molecule, and I know students are often intimidated when they first look at that. They're like, that doesn't mean anything to me. Okay, but it's not really that scary. Take a look at it. I told you that it was a ladder. So here are the posts of the ladder, and I'm going to show you. This is one, they call it the backbone of DNA, or the posts of the ladder. It goes phosphate, sugar, there's the 5 sides, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, and it repeats and repeats and repeats and repeats for 3 billion steps. Okay, and over here, there's the other post of the ladder or the other backbone, and it also goes phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar. So super repetitive. When you first look at it, DNA is really intimidating. Once you get the hang of it, it's not so bad. Now, in the middle are the nitrogen bases, and we've labeled them A, T, C, and G, and there's 4 different ones, and they can come in different orders, and the different orders is what determines whether somebody has green eyes or brown eyes, or the different order is what determines whether somebody has black hair or blonde hair or curly hair or straight hair. It's the differences in the letters. I will tell you that human beings are incredibly similar. You and I share probably, I don't know the exact number, but I'll say 99.99% of the exact A's, T's, C's, and G's in exactly the same places. The things that make us different are just a tiny percentage of our DNA. That's because you and I both have 2 hands. We probably have 10 fingers and 10 toes, 2 eyes, 2 lungs, 2 kidneys, a heart, the things that we have in common. And even if we don't have all those things that I just said in common, that's just due to a tiny change in your DNA. Most of your DNA is just like my DNA. All right, and then down at the bottom, it says there are 4 nitrogen bases, A across from T and G across from C. Almost to the end here. It says there are many different ways to draw a DNA molecule. Those are all different ways to draw a DNA molecule. But scientists, and this is super important, scientists have decided, they've kind of gotten together and said, we all know phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar on this side, and phosphate, sugar, and phosphate, sugar on the other side. Do we really have to draw that every time? So they decided to not draw the posts because it just takes a long time to draw. And then they also know that anytime you see an A, there's going to be a T across from it. Anytime you see a G, there's going to be a C across from it. So then they said, do we have to draw the other side at all? And so this is how scientists now show DNA. They just show it in a bunch of letters. They're ignoring the sugar phosphate backbone and they're ignoring the opposite side. So I want you to try to figure out what would go across. So if the left side, if that's all they had written down was just the left side, the letters that would be opposite would be T, A, and then what goes across from C, G, what goes across from G, C, what goes across from A or T, A, T, C, G. That's how they do it. All right, that's it. Let me know if you have questions.